People used to tell me how lucky I was. You have such a beautiful family. Your mom does so much for the community. I've always admired the Whitakers. I learned to smile whenever I heard those sentences. Correcting people only made me sound bitter, and bitter daughters always lose against charming mothers. My name is Nora Whitaker. I'm 27 years old, and for most of my life I believed there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Not because anyone ever proved it, because I heard it often enough that eventually I stopped asking questions. If you searched my mother's name online, you'd find photos of charity galas, church fundraisers, holiday toy drives, and smiling families standing beside oversized donation checks. Vivian Whitaker knew exactly how to build a reputation. She just built it with bricks she quietly stole from mine. My stepfather, Grant, owned a home renovation company. Around town, he had the reputation of being dependable, hardworking, the kind of man who would show up after a storm to repair someone's roof before fixing his own. At home, he barely looked at me unless he needed free labor. Then there was Paige, my younger half-sister. Bright smile, perfect hair, a social media account that grew every month. Every family dinner somehow became another opportunity to celebrate one of Paige's milestones: a sponsorship, a new collaboration, a magazine feature, a product launch. If I happened to accomplish something, it disappeared before dessert. I stopped competing years ago. It was easier to become invisible. People assume favoritism happens through dramatic moments. It usually doesn't. It happens one small decision at a time. Paige received the larger bedroom because she needed creative space. She received a better laptop because her future depended on it. She attended private school because she had extraordinary potential. When I needed textbooks for community college, Mom folded her hands and sighed. "We just don't have room in the budget, sweetheart." The conversation always ended the same way. Somehow I became the selfish one for asking. I worked nights, weekend shifts, holiday overtime, whatever paid enough to keep moving. Every paycheck disappeared into rent, groceries, insurance, or student loans. Meanwhile, our family Christmas card always included the caption, "Blessed beyond measure." I wasn't even in some of those photos. The strange thing wasn't being excluded. It was watching people believe the picture more than reality. Neighbors loved my mother. Church members adored her. Business owners trusted her. Whenever someone discovered I was Vivian's daughter, they'd smile. "Oh, your mom talks about you all the time." I always wondered which version, because it certainly wasn't me. Years later, I would learn that she'd spent more than a decade telling people I was difficult, ungrateful, financially irresponsible, emotionally unstable. She never lied dramatically. She lied quietly. She'd lower her voice just enough to sound concerned instead of cruel. Nora has always struggled. We pray for her every day. It's hard loving a child who keeps making bad choices. People believed her because compassion sounds convincing when spoken softly. No one ever asked what those bad choices actually were. There weren't any. The story simply filled the silence before facts ever could. By the time someone met me, they already thought they knew me. That was the most painful part. I wasn't fighting against one rumor. I was fighting against a reputation carefully maintained for years, and I didn't even know it existed. There was only one person who never treated me that way. My grandmother, Evelyn Mercer. She never interrupted my mother during family dinners. She never argued. She simply watched. Sometimes she'd slide another dinner roll onto my plate when everyone else was busy talking over me. Sometimes she'd leave old accounting books on the porch with a sticky note. "Thought you might enjoy chapter 4. At 16, I didn't understand why she cared so much about receipts, contracts, and filing cabinets. She'd smile whenever I asked. "Paper remembers." That sentence stayed with me. At the time, I thought she meant balancing a checkbook. I had no idea she meant surviving a family. After Grandma passed away, the house became quieter. Not peaceful, just quieter. No one mentioned her lessons anymore. No one talked about numbers unless they wanted something from me. The little navy metal box she left behind stayed on the top shelf of my closet for years. I never opened it. Mom told me Grandma had become confused near the end. She probably forgot what she put inside. so I believed her, just like I believed almost everything else. Looking back now, I realize something that took me 27 years to understand. The biggest lie my family ever told wasn't about money. It wasn't about success. It wasn't even about who deserved love. The biggest lie was convincing me that I deserved less than everyone else. For a long time, I accepted that role because I didn't know another one existed. I thought surviving was enough. I didn't know someone had been quietly preparing me for the truth long before I was ready to find it. I used to think every family made difficult financial choices. Someone had to wait. Someone had to sacrifice. Someone had to understand that there simply wasn't enough money. In our house, that someone was always me. The strange part was that nobody ever announced it as a decision. It was presented as common sense. If Paige needed something, we found a way. If I needed something, we discussed budgets. When I graduated from high school, I wanted exactly one thing: college, not an expensive private university, nothing glamorous. I had been accepted into Appalachian State with enough scholarships to cover almost half the tuition. I had spent 2 years working weekends, filling out applications, and writing essays while everyone else in the house focused on Paige's dance competitions and growing social media account. The acceptance letter felt like proof that I could build a life outside our family. Mom looked genuinely happy when it arrived. She hugged me, she cried. She even posted a picture online saying how proud she was of both of her daughters. For a week, I believed everything was finally changing. Then the conversation started. We're waiting on paperwork. The market has been rough. Grant's business is carrying a lot right now. Just give us another week. Another week became another month. Orientation came and went. Housing deadlines passed. Every time I asked about tuition, Mom looked exhausted before I even finished the sentence. I hate that this is happening, she'd say. If we had the money, you know we'd help. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my mother. Eventually, I withdrew before classes even started. I told everyone it was my decision. I repeated that lie so many times it almost sounded true. I found a full-time job at a local warehouse unloading delivery trucks during the night shift. The work was simple. Heavy boxes, cold loading docks, long hours. By sunrise, my hands ached so badly that turning the steering wheel hurt. During the day, I took classes at the community college whenever I could afford another semester. It wasn't the future I'd imagined, but it was still mine. At least that's what I told myself. Around the same time, Paige's life seemed to move in the opposite direction. She transferred into an expensive private academy across town. She started traveling for content creation workshops. Grant built a small recording studio in the bonus room above the garage. Professional lights, camera equipment, custom shelving, fresh paint. Whenever relatives asked how they managed to afford everything, Mom smiled and said the same sentence: "We're investing in the child who found her calling." Nobody questioned what that meant for the other child. One Sunday afternoon, I came home after working 12 straight hours. The kitchen table was covered with brochures, photography retreats, branding conferences, marketing seminars. Paige sat between Mom and Grant, laughing as they planned a weekend trip to Nashville. I opened the refrigerator, hoping there might still be leftover soup. Mom looked over her shoulder. "Oh, Nora, we forgot to tell you. We'll need you to watch the house next weekend." I nodded. "Sure." She smiled with relief. "I knew you'd understand." That was always the reward for sacrificing. People thanked me for making their lives easier. No one asked what it cost me. Months passed that way. Work, bills, sleep, repeat. Whenever I managed to save a little money, something happened. Grant's truck needed repairs. The water heater failed. A client canceled a renovation contract. Mom never demanded anything directly. She simply described the problem until I volunteered. "You've always been the responsible one." Looking back, I realized responsibility became another word for available. I was available because my own dreams had already been postponed. One evening, I came home carrying my latest student loan statement. The balance wasn't enormous compared to many people, but every payment reminded me of the education I never really had the chance to finish. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter. Mom glanced at it. Still paying those off? I nodded. She sighed dramatically. That's why young people need to make smarter financial decisions. The words landed harder than I expected. Those weren't my decisions, not really. But arguing would have changed nothing. Grant kept eating dinner without looking up. Paige was editing a video on her tablet. Life moved on. Mine always seemed to pause while everyone else's continued. Years later, after everything had fallen apart, I found myself replaying one memory more than any other. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody yelled. Nobody cried. Mom had asked me to stop by her home office to help organize old filing boxes before a charity fundraiser. Most of the folders contained donation receipts and event budgets. Near the bottom of one box sat a faded accordion folder labeled simply, Education. I reached for it automatically. Mom crossed the room faster than I'd ever seen her move. Oh, not that one. She pulled it from my hands with a smile that came half a second too late. Just old tax paperwork. She slid it into a cabinet and locked the drawer. I didn't think much about it then. Families keep private records. That seemed normal. But something about the speed of her reaction stayed with me. The next morning before leaving for work, I remembered seeing a single corner of a bank statement sticking out of that folder. Not enough to read everything, just enough to catch one phrase. Mercer Educational Fund. At the time, I assumed it belonged to someone else. I had never heard those words before. I certainly didn't know they had anything to do with me. So I went to work, loaded another truck, worked another 12-hour shift, paid another student loan bill, and kept carrying a debt I believed was mine alone. I had no way of knowing that somewhere inside my mother's locked filing cabinet was the first piece of paper that could explain why my future had quietly disappeared years earlier. I simply accepted the life I'd been handed because I still believed the people who raised me would never steal the future they kept insisting I had thrown away myself. People sometimes ask whether I ever had anyone on my side. The answer is yes. I just didn't realize how much she had done until years after she was gone. My grandmother, Evelyn Mercer, wasn't loud. She never argued across the dinner table. She never embarrassed anyone. She didn't believe every battle needed to happen in public. She believed the important ones happened long before anyone realized they had started. She had spent almost 40 years working as an accountant before retiring. Numbers were her language. She noticed patterns other people ignored. If 2 receipts didn't match, she'd find out why. If someone changed one date on one document, she'd notice before lunch. Mom used to joke that Grandma could balance a checkbook faster than most people could read one. Grandma would smile politely. She never corrected her. When I was 14, she started inviting me over every Saturday morning. At first, I thought she simply wanted company. We'd drink tea in her small kitchen while sunlight came through the old lace curtains. After breakfast, she'd carry a cardboard box to the dining room table. Inside were canceled checks, bank statements, old insurance forms, tax returns from years ago. I looked at her one morning and laughed. "Grandma, why are we doing paperwork on a Saturday?" She slid a yellow legal pad toward me. "Because paperwork tells the truth after people stop talking." That sounded strange to a teenager. Still, I stayed. She taught me how to compare signatures, how to read account numbers, how to check dates instead of headlines, how to look at the final page before believing the first one. "Anyone can write a beautiful story," she said. "Paper tells you whether they paid for it." At the time, I thought she was simply teaching practical life skills. Now I know she was teaching survival. The older I became, the more I noticed small moments that didn't make sense. Grandma always watched before she spoke. If Mom praised Paige for some new achievement, Grandma would smile. If Mom criticized me for working too much or not smiling enough, Grandma stayed quiet. But later, when everyone else had gone home, she'd ask simple questions. "How many hours did you work this week? Did you eat today? Are you sleeping enough?" Nobody else ever asked those questions. One afternoon after my first semester at community college, I told Grandma I was thinking about dropping one of my classes. Money was getting tight again. She didn't lecture me. She simply asked, "Do you want to drop it?" I looked down. "I don't know." She nodded slowly. "That's not what I asked." I realized then that somewhere along the way I'd stopped separating my own choices from everyone else's expectations. That frightened her more than my tuition ever did. Grandma never criticized Mom in front of me, not once. Looking back, I think she understood something I didn't. Children defend their parents until reality becomes impossible to ignore. If she had attacked my mother directly, I probably would have defended her. Instead, she let me observe. She trusted time. About a year before she died, we were sitting on the porch watching rain roll across the mountains. She looked unusually tired, older, quieter. "Nora," she said, "if someone repeats the same story about you long enough, eventually people stop checking whether it's true." I remember laughing awkwardly. "That's kind of depressing." "It is." She took another sip of tea. "But it also means the truth survives in places stories can't reach." I didn't ask what she meant. I wish I had. Her health declined quickly after that. Heart problems, doctor appointments, medication schedules written in careful handwriting on sticky notes around the kitchen. Mom visited more often during those months. Everyone praised her devotion. They called her a wonderful daughter. Grandma never disagreed. She simply watched. The last time we spent an afternoon together, she asked me to help organize boxes in her study. Most contained old family photographs and financial files from her career. Near the back of the closet sat a small navy metal box. It looked ordinary, a little worn around the corners. She picked it up with both hands and placed it in front of me. "I want you to keep this." I smiled. "What's inside?" She rested her hand on the lid. "Not yet." I laughed. "Seriously?" She smiled back. "One day you'll know exactly when." That answer frustrated me. I wanted explanations. Instead, she gave me instructions. "Don't lose it." "I won't." "Don't let anyone talk you into opening it before you're ready." "I promise." "And remember one thing." She leaned forward just enough for me to hear every word. "When somebody tells you who you are, always look for the paper." A week later, she was admitted to the hospital. 2 weeks after that, she was gone. At the funeral, people talked about her kindness, her discipline, her intelligence. Mom stood near the entrance, greeting guests with perfect composure. She cried at the right moments. She hugged the right people. She thanked everyone for coming. No one noticed that during the reception, she quietly slipped away from the crowd and disappeared upstairs for nearly 20 minutes. At the time, I assumed she needed privacy. Now I sometimes wonder what she was looking for. After the funeral, she handed me the Navy box without saying much. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this." Her voice sounded almost indifferent. She probably filled it with old keepsakes. I carried it home, placed it on the top shelf of my closet, and left it there. For 9 years. Sometimes I'd see it while putting away winter clothes. I'd think about opening it. Then I'd remember Grandma's words. Not yet. I trusted her enough to wait. I didn't know that while I was leaving the box untouched, someone else had already begun building an entirely different story around my life. And somewhere inside that little Navy box, the first real chapter of my own story had been waiting patiently for me all along. For almost 2 years, I had learned how to keep my distance from my family without making it obvious. I answered birthday texts. I showed up on Thanksgiving. I mailed Christmas gifts. From the outside, everything looked normal. Inside, I had quietly stopped expecting anything from them. That distance lasted until the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Mom called while I was organizing a shipment at work. She almost never called during business hours. "Nora," she said warmly, "I need a favor." There it was. Not "how are you?" Not "I've missed you." Always a favor. "Our charity gala is only a few weeks away. We're overwhelmed." She laughed softly. "You've always been the organized one." I leaned against a pallet of lighting fixtures and closed my eyes. "What do you need?" "Just a couple of evenings." It would mean everything to the family. That sentence had followed me my entire life. Everything to the family, almost always at my expense. I told her I'd think about it. She didn't give me the chance. "Oh, wonderful. I knew you would." By the time the call ended, she'd already assumed I was coming. Saturday afternoon, I pulled into the driveway of the house where I'd spent most of my life. Nothing had changed. Grant's company truck sat in the driveway. Paige's SUV was parked beside it with fresh branding decals promoting her lifestyle channel. A banner leaned against the garage wall. Homes of Grace Winter Benefit Gala. The event looked expensive, professional, successful, exactly the kind of image Mom loved creating. She greeted me with a hug that lasted just long enough for anyone watching to believe we were close. There she is, our lifesaver. Grant walked through the hallway carrying blueprints. Glad you made it. He handed me 3 thick binders before I had even taken off my coat. We're behind. No thank you, no explanation, just work. The dining room had become command central: guest lists, vendor contracts, donation packages, auction catalogs. Everything was stacked into careful piles. It looked less like a family home and more like a corporate office. Paige breezed into the room wearing designer workout clothes. Perfect timing. She pointed toward a table covered in product samples. I need these organized by brand collaboration. She didn't ask. She assigned, just like everyone else. For the next several hours, I worked quietly. Honestly, I was good at this. Planning logistics, matching invoices, tracking deliveries, making impossible schedules fit together. Organization had become second nature after years of solving everyone else's problems. Around 6 that evening, Grant dropped another folder beside me. Need these supplier invoices entered before Monday. He disappeared before I could answer. I opened the folder automatically. The first few pages were ordinary. Printing estimates, rental equipment, catering deposits. Then something caught my eye. At the bottom of one invoice sat a familiar name. Authorized contact, Nora Whitaker. I frowned. That couldn't be right. I flipped to another invoice. Again. Authorized contact, Nora Whitaker. Different company, different date, same designation. I searched through several more, 5 separate vendors. Every one of them listed me. Not as an emergency contact, not as an assistant, as an authorized representative. My stomach tightened. I had never spoken to any of these companies. I walked into the kitchen where Mom was arranging centerpiece samples. Hey, she looked up. What is it, sweetheart? These vendor forms. My name is listed as the authorized contact. She barely glanced at the papers. Oh, that's just administrative. They needed someone available if Grant was on a job site. I never agreed to that, she smiled. You didn't need to. It's only paperwork. Only paperwork. Grandma's voice echoed somewhere deep inside my memory. Paper remembers. I pushed a little further. Did I sign anything? Mom laughed. Nora, you've become so suspicious. She kissed my forehead like I was 12 years old again. Don't overthink it. Then she changed the subject. Can you help Paige with inventory? Most people would have accepted that answer. For years. I would have accepted it too. But something felt different, not dramatic, just wrong. Later that night, while everyone else was busy discussing auction seating, I returned to the invoices. This time I wasn't looking at the totals. I was looking at the details. Vendor addresses, purchase order numbers, approval dates. Most people never read the bottom of business paperwork. Grandma always had. I remembered that. One invoice included an email address beside my name, n.whitaker.operations@gmail. I stared at it. I hadn't used that account in almost 5 years. I wasn't even sure I still remembered the password. Why would anyone still be using it? Before leaving that evening, I quietly took a picture of the invoice with my phone. Just one. I told myself it was because something looked inconsistent, nothing more. Driving home through the mountains, I kept replaying Mom's words. It's only paperwork. Maybe she was right. Maybe it really was nothing. Maybe companies listed old contacts all the time. I wanted to believe that. Life was easier when there was an innocent explanation. But somewhere between Asheville and my apartment, another memory surfaced. Grandma sitting across from me at her dining room table, sliding a bank statement toward me, smiling as she tapped the bottom of the page. Never trust the headline. Always read the last line. When I got home, I enlarged the photo on my phone. The approval section was almost too small to read. I zoomed in again, and again. At the very bottom, beneath the vendor information, was a digital approval record showing that the document had been processed through an electronic signature service. I hadn't signed it. I knew I hadn't. But for the first time in my life, I also realized that simply saying, "I didn't do it," might not be enough. If someone had used my name on one document, I needed to know whether it was the only one. I barely slept that night. It wasn't because I thought someone had committed a crime. Not yet. It was because I couldn't make the details fit together. Every business I'd ever worked for had strict approval procedures. Vendor contacts didn't just appear on contracts by accident. Someone entered that information. Someone approved it. Someone decided my name belonged there. By Monday morning, I had convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. During my lunch break, I sat alone in my car and tried logging into the old Gmail account listed on the invoice. I hadn't touched it since I was 22. The password didn't work. Neither did the backup password. When I clicked Forgot Password, Google showed the recovery options. The recovery email wasn't mine anymore. Neither was the recovery phone number. I stared at the last 2 digits on the screen. 74. That wasn't my number. It never had been. Someone hadn't just used my old account. Someone had taken control of it. I felt my heartbeat speed up. Still, I forced myself to stay calm. There was a difference between suspicion and proof. I needed proof. That evening, I called the print company listed on one of the invoices. I introduced myself. "Hi, this is Nora Whitaker. I have a question about one of your vendor accounts." The receptionist transferred me to their accounts coordinator. He was friendly, professional. "What can I help you with?" I gave him the invoice number. I heard typing, then silence. "Looks like you're our operations contact for the Homes of Grace Winter Benefit." "I'm sorry. I don't actually work for that organization." Another pause. "Really? Your name is all over the account." He wasn't accusing me. He sounded confused. "Can you tell me what email you have on file?" He read the same address I'd seen on the invoice. Then he added something I wasn't expecting. "We've been communicating with you since March." March, 8 months. I haven't received any emails. That's strange. You've replied several times. My stomach dropped. Would it be possible to forward me one of those conversations? He hesitated. "I'll need approval." "I understand. I'll submit the request." We ended the call politely. I sat there gripping my phone. Someone had been pretending to be me for months, and they hadn't made one mistake. They had answered emails, approved proofs, confirmed deliveries. Everything looked legitimate. I drove home in complete silence. For years, I had believed my biggest problem was being underestimated. Now I wasn't sure anyone even knew who I really was. The next morning, I called my friend Marin Bell. We'd met years earlier through a volunteer project and stayed in touch even after life pulled us in different directions. She worked in compliance for a regional credit union. She couldn't access private records outside her institution, but she understood fraud better than anyone I knew. When I explained what I'd found, she didn't interrupt. She simply listened. Finally, she asked one question. "Nora, have you checked your credit recently?" "No." "You should. Today." Her tone alone convinced me. That evening, I requested my full credit report. Most of it looked familiar. Student loans, my car payment, one credit card. Then I reached an account I didn't recognize. A commercial loan. $75,000. Opened 8 months earlier. My breathing stopped. I read the page again. Borrower information. Nora Whitaker. Current status. Active. Payment history. On time. The lender wasn't my bank. The mailing address wasn't mine. The contact email was the same old Gmail account. I immediately called the number listed on the report. After verifying my identity, the representative sounded puzzled. "You've already spoken with us several times." "No, I haven't. We have detailed call logs." "I've never called." Silence. I think you need to file an identity fraud report. I thanked her, hung up, and simply stared at the wall. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was trying to understand the scale of what I was looking at. This wasn't one forged signature. It wasn't one incorrect invoice. Someone had built an entire financial identity using my name. Later that night, I spread every document across my dining table. The invoice photo, my credit report, the handwritten notes I'd taken during the phone calls. For the first time since Grandma died, I remembered exactly how she used to organize evidence. Not by importance, by chronology. One document led to another. One date explained the next. Paper remembered. People didn't. I wrote one word at the top of a yellow legal pad. March. Everything seemed to begin there. The vendor emails, the commercial loan, the electronic approvals. I had no idea what had happened in March. But whoever had borrowed my identity had started then. And they had grown confident enough to believe no one would ever look closely. I folded the credit report and placed it inside a manila folder. Not because I knew what to do next, because for the first time in my life, I was done relying on memories. From now on, I was going to rely on documents. For the next 3 days, my apartment looked less like a place to live and more like a temporary investigation room. Every evening after work, I'd spread papers across my dining table. The vendor invoice, my credit report, notes from the phone calls, screenshots from the password recovery page. I bought a package of colored sticky notes on my way home from work. Blue for confirmed facts, yellow for questions, red for anything that involved money. Grandma used colors. I finally understood why. When information becomes emotional, organization keeps you honest. I wasn't trying to prove my family guilty. I was trying to understand what was actually happening. There was a difference. Friday evening, Maren stopped by after work carrying 2 coffees and a notebook. She looked around my apartment and smiled. "You've officially turned into Evelyn." I laughed for the first time all week. "I hope that's a compliment." "It absolutely is." She sat down across from me. "Start from the beginning." For almost 2 hours, I walked her through everything. The invoices, the fake email account, the commercial loan, the conversations with the print company. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't immediately talk about fraud. She pointed to the timeline I'd written on a legal pad. "March." "You keep circling March." "I know. I just don't know why." She leaned back. "Let's stop asking what happened. Let's ask what changed." That question landed differently. I thought about it for a long moment. What had changed in March? Grant's renovation company had started advertising much more aggressively. Paige had announced her first product collection. Mom had begun posting almost daily about the upcoming Homes of Grace initiative. Everything seemed to accelerate around the same time. Maren opened her notebook. Businesses leave paper trails. So do people. If someone used your identity, they probably used it because something else wasn't available. She wasn't guessing. She was thinking. Exactly the way Grandma used to. She suggested I request every consumer disclosure I legally could. Credit reports, banking alerts, business registration records, electronic signature history. None of those documents would solve the mystery by themselves, but together, they might tell a story. Saturday morning, I started making requests. Some could be downloaded immediately. Others required identity verification. A few would take several business days. I wasn't frustrated anymore. I had stopped looking for one dramatic answer. Now I was collecting pieces. By Sunday afternoon, the first new report arrived. It listed every recent inquiry made using my Social Security number. Most were familiar. My auto loan, insurance, apartment screening. Then one stood out. A regional commercial lender had checked my credit 8 months earlier. I didn't recognize the company. More importantly, the inquiry listed a business application, not a personal one. I called the lender Monday morning. After verifying my identity, the representative sounded increasingly uncomfortable. "Our records indicate the application was submitted electronically. Can you tell me from where?" "I'm sorry. I can't disclose everything over the phone." I understand. But I can confirm something. She paused. The business listed on the application was Whitaker Renovations. For several seconds, I couldn't answer. Grant hadn't simply borrowed my identity. His own company appeared on the application. That changed everything. Before that phone call, I thought someone might have stolen my information. Now, it felt personal. Very personal. I thanked the representative and ended the call. Instead of panicking, I opened my notebook. Another blue sticky note. Commercial loan to Whitaker Renovations fact. Not assumption. That afternoon, Marin called. I've been thinking. I know I can't access your records, but I can tell you what investigators usually look for. I grabbed my notebook. Tell me. Fraud almost never starts with the biggest transaction. It starts with the smallest successful test. I frowned. What do you mean? If someone learns they can use another person's identity without getting caught, they usually become bolder. That sentence stayed with me all evening. Had there been something before the loan? Something smaller? I reopened the vendor invoices. This time I ignored the signatures. Instead, I looked at dates. One approval, then another, then another. The pattern became obvious. The first invoice approved under my name totaled less than $400. The next one was $800, then $2,100, then almost $6,000. Every approval became larger. Every approval became more confident. Someone had tested the system. When nobody questioned it, they kept going. I wasn't looking at random paperwork anymore. I was looking at escalation. Exactly the kind Grandma used to warn me about. People rarely wake up one morning willing to commit major fraud. They start with something they think nobody will notice. Success becomes permission. Permission becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. Late Tuesday afternoon, another email arrived. This one came from the electronic signature company. They couldn't release protected documents without legal process, but they did provide something unexpected. An activity summary. Each document had been signed from the same internet connection, the same device fingerprint. Over and over again. I couldn't identify the device. But I didn't need to. The important part was consistency. One person. One computer. One location. Not multiple hackers. Not random identity theft. Someone had been operating a system. I carefully placed the activity report inside the growing folder. The evidence wasn't pointing in 10 different directions anymore. It was beginning to converge. Every document, every approval, every inquiry, every loan. They all touched the same business, the same timeline, the same circle of people. For the first time since finding my name on those invoices, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. I wasn't. The paper wasn't accusing anyone. It was simply remembering. And for the first time in years, I felt something stronger than fear, purpose. Because once a paper trail begins, it doesn't care who gets hurt. It only keeps leading forward. The Navy box had followed me through 3 apartments. Every time I moved, I packed it first and unpacked it last. It always ended up on the highest shelf of whatever closet I happened to have. Not because I had forgotten about it, because I had promised. For years, I thought keeping that promise was enough. Now I wasn't so sure. After finding the commercial loan connected to Grant's company, I couldn't stop thinking about Grandma's last words. When somebody tells you who you are, always look for the paper. I had finally started looking. And the paper wasn't telling the same story my family had told me for years. Wednesday evening, I stood in front of my closet longer than I cared to admit. The apartment was completely silent. Rain tapped softly against the windows. My hand rested on the closet doorknob while I argued with myself. Maybe this still wasn't the right time. Maybe I was letting fear make decisions. Or maybe this was exactly why she'd asked me to wait. I reached onto the top shelf. The box was heavier than I remembered. The navy paint had faded around the edges, and one corner had a small scratch from my second apartment in Greenville. Otherwise, it looked exactly the same. I carried it to the dining table and just stared at it. No music, no television, no phone. It felt wrong to rush something that had waited 9 years. The latch opened with almost no resistance. Inside wasn't money. There wasn't jewelry, no dramatic stack of legal documents. At first glance, it almost looked disappointing. A worn leather notebook, a brass key attached to a small white tag, an old photograph, and a folded cream-colored envelope with my name written in Evelyn Mercer's careful handwriting. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. I picked up the photograph first. Grandma stood in front of a small cedar cabin overlooking a lake. She was younger than I remembered. Standing beside her was a man I didn't recognize. On the back, she had written only one sentence. "Some homes are protected long before anyone needs shelter." I turned the picture over twice, nothing else. The brass key felt unusually heavy. The tag simply read, Box 218, no address, no explanation, just a number. I unfolded the envelope next. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Nora, if you're opening this because life has finally forced you to ask questions instead of accepting answers, then you've waited exactly as long as I hoped you would. Don't try to solve everything alone. Take the key. Find Thomas Greer. Trust the documents before you trust the people. Love, Grandma." That was it. No explanation. Just another instruction. I smiled despite myself. Even after all these years, Grandma was still making me work for the answers. The leather notebook contained page after page of handwritten entries. At first, they looked like ordinary bookkeeping notes. Dates, check numbers, account balances, names. Most entries were more than 10 years old. Some referred to grocery expenses, property taxes, insurance renewals. Nothing seemed connected to me. I almost closed the notebook. Then I remembered another lesson. Always read the last line. Instead of reading from the beginning, I flipped to the final written page. Most of it contained columns of numbers. At the bottom, one sentence had been underlined twice. Thomas Greer, fiduciary attorney. Below his name was an office address in downtown Asheville. Nothing else. No explanation. No instructions. Just his name. I immediately searched him online. The law firm still existed. Thomas Greer specialized almost exclusively in trusts, estates, and fiduciary litigation. That seemed oddly specific. Why would Grandma send me to an estate attorney almost a decade after she passed away? I called the office the next morning before work. The receptionist answered cheerfully, "Greer and Associates." I almost hung up. Instead, I took a deep breath. "My name is Nora Whitaker. I think Evelyn Mercer may have left instructions for me." Silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Surprised silence. "May I place you on hold for just a moment?" Less than 30 seconds later, another voice came on the line. Older. Calm. "Nora?" "Yes." "This is Thomas Greer. I've been hoping you'd call someday." My heart skipped. "You know who I am?" "I knew your grandmother. For a very long time." I looked at the notebook lying open beside me. "She left me your name. I suspected she might. I have a key." Another pause. "The brass one?" "Yes." His voice softened. "Then don't describe anything else over the phone." "I'd like to meet with you." "When?" "The sooner the better." We scheduled Friday morning. After hanging up, I simply sat there staring at the wall. For years, I believed my grandmother had left me memories. Instead, she had left me a process. Every answer led to another question. Every question led to another document. She wasn't giving me shortcuts. She was teaching me to verify everything myself. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. Mom. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered, "Hi. Nora. You disappeared so quickly last weekend. I hope you'll be back Saturday. We're finalizing everything for the gala." I looked at the navy box still sitting on my dining table. "I'll let you know." She laughed lightly. "You've always been so dependable." When the call ended, I realized something. For the first time in my life, I hadn't automatically said yes. It was a tiny decision. Maybe nobody else would have noticed. But I did, because for years, every choice I'd made had started with what my family needed. Friday morning. For the first time, I was going somewhere because I needed answers. Thomas Greer's office sat on the second floor of a brick building in downtown Asheville. It wasn't fancy. No marble floors, no oversized reception desk, just shelves filled with leather-bound law books, framed degrees, and enough filing cabinets to make my grandmother feel at home. The receptionist greeted me by name before I introduced myself. "Mr. Greer is expecting you." That sentence alone made my stomach tighten. When Thomas stepped into the lobby, he looked exactly the way I'd imagined from his voice. Mid-60s, silver hair, dark blue suit, the kind of face that had spent decades listening before speaking. He shook my hand with both of his. "You have Evelyn's eyes." It caught me off guard. No one had ever said that before. He led me into his office and waited until the door closed before speaking again. "Did you bring the key?" I reached into my purse and placed the brass key on his desk. He didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, he looked at it for several quiet seconds. "I haven't seen this in almost 9 years. You knew she'd leave it to me?" "I knew she'd leave it to someone. She hoped it would be you." That answer confused me. "Hoped?" Thomas folded his hands. "Your grandmother believed answers should be earned, not inherited. She wanted you to come because you chose to ask questions, not because someone told you to." I thought about the Navy box sitting on my dining table. For years, I believed I had been waiting for permission. Now I understood. She had been waiting for curiosity. Thomas unlocked one of the lower drawers in his desk. Inside rested a thick navy binder. Across the front was a handwritten label. Mercer Family Asset Trust, my grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. He placed the binder between us. "I've kept this for almost a decade. I was instructed never to contact you. You had to come willingly." I looked at him. "Why?" "Because your grandmother believed that if someone handed you the truth too early, you'd still be trying to protect the people hurting you." The words landed harder than I expected, because they were true. 9 years ago, I would have defended my mother without hesitation. Thomas opened the binder. The first document wasn't a will. It wasn't a deed. It was the trust agreement itself. Prepared nearly 9 years earlier. Signed by Evelyn Mercer. Witnessed. Notarized. Completely valid. Your grandmother transferred several assets into this trust during the last years of her life. I quietly nodded. "Okay." He smiled slightly. "You don't sound surprised." "I've stopped assuming I know anything." "I think she'd be proud to hear that." He turned another page. "The trust has only one lifetime beneficiary." He slid the document toward me. My name appeared in the center of the page. Nora Elizabeth Whitaker. I stared at it, not because I didn't believe it, because I couldn't understand why. "Why me?" Thomas answered without hesitation. "Because she trusted your character. Not your circumstances, not your income, not your relationship with your family. Your character. No one had ever explained inheritance that way before." The next page contained a property record, a cedar cabin overlooking Lake Lure, the same cabin from the old photograph. Current owner, Mercer Family Asset Trust. I looked up. "That's real?" "It always has been. Your grandmother purchased it years before she retired." I remembered the photograph again. Some homes are protected long before anyone needs shelter. Suddenly, the sentence meant something completely different. Thomas continued. "The trust also includes an investment account." He turned another page. The statement showed years of steady growth. Dividends, reinvestments, careful management. The current balance made my heart stop. Just over $238,000. I immediately shook my head. There has to be some mistake. "There isn't. I've never—" "I know." Thomas's voice remained calm. "You've never received $1. It wasn't time." I leaned back in my chair. Everything felt strangely quiet. Not exciting, heavy, like discovering an entirely different version of my own life. Then Thomas opened another section. "This part is important." He removed a separate folder. Inside sat several corporate documents, share certificates, board resolutions, investment agreements, I recognized one company name immediately, Whitaker Renovations, Grant's company. I frowned. Why is his business in here? Thomas looked directly at me. Because one of the trust's investments helped keep it alive. I blinked. What? Years ago, your stepfather needed outside capital. He never knew who supplied part of it. The investment came through the trust. I stared at him. Grant had spent years talking about building his company from nothing. Apparently, that wasn't entirely true. Thomas slid one certificate across the desk. Ownership. Interest. 18%. Held by Mercer Family Asset Trust. I looked at the document, then back at him. So, the trust owns part of Grant's company? It does. He doesn't know? Thomas smiled for the first time that morning. No. And unless someone tells him, he won't. The room suddenly felt smaller, not because of the money, because of what it meant. My family had spent years treating me like someone who depended on them. The truth was quietly sitting inside a law office they didn't even know existed. I wasn't rich. I wasn't suddenly powerful. But for the first time, I wasn't powerless either. Thomas closed the folder. Before you ask. Yes. There's more. But your grandmother gave me very specific instructions. What instructions? He folded his glasses and placed them on the desk. I reveal the trust one layer at a time. Only after each previous layer becomes necessary. I laughed softly. That sounds exactly like her. It does. He handed me copies of only a few documents, not everything. Why not the entire file? Because we're not preparing for a family argument. We're preparing for a legal process. That sentence changed how I saw everything. Until now, I'd been trying to understand my family. Thomas wasn't interested in understanding them. He was interested in proving facts. As I gathered the documents into my folder, he gave me one final instruction. Don't confront anyone. Not yet. If people believe they're winning, they become careless. I remembered the forged signatures, the commercial loan, the fake email account. He was right. The evidence wasn't finished. The paper trail was still growing. And for the first time since this all began, I wasn't following it blindly anymore. I finally knew there was a destination. I walked out of Thomas Greer's office carrying only a thin folder. Compared to the thick trust binder sitting inside his office, it felt almost empty. A copy of the trust agreement, proof that the Mercer Family Asset Trust existed, documentation showing the trust owned the cabin at Lake Lure, evidence that it held an ownership interest in Whitaker Renovations. That was all. I expected him to hand me everything. Instead, he handed me discipline. The last thing he said before I left kept repeating in my mind. Don't interrupt someone who's digging their own hole. For years, I had imagined confronting my mother. I pictured putting every document on the kitchen table, demanding answers, watching everyone admit what they had done. Thomas had dismantled that fantasy in less than an hour. People who lie for years don't suddenly become honest because you bring paper. They become more desperate. That wasn't the ending I wanted, but it was probably the truthful one. Instead of driving to my mother's house, I went back to work Monday morning. I unloaded shipments, answered emails, finished inventory reports. On the surface, nothing changed. Inside, everything had. For the first time, I knew something my family didn't, and that knowledge made patience easier. Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed. Mom, just checking in. We missed you at the planning meeting. I waited almost an hour before replying. Work ran late. Her response came immediately. The gala can't happen without everyone's support. That wording caught my attention. Not your support. Everyone's support. As if refusing to help automatically meant betraying the family. I didn't argue. I simply replied, I'll see what I can do. Another lesson from Grandma surfaced. Never correct a person who's volunteering information. They usually reveal more if they believe you agree. 2 days later, Paige posted another video. Normally, I ignored her social media. This time, I watched. She was standing inside the ballroom where the charity gala would be held. Workers moved tables behind her while she smiled into the camera. "This year's event is all about family," she laughed. "It takes every single one of us working together." Then she turned the camera toward a planning table. For barely 2 seconds, my name appeared on a printed operations schedule. Nora Whitaker, Event Operations. I paused the video, zoomed in, took a screenshot, another document, another date, another use of my name. I saved the image inside the same folder that now held every piece of evidence. Not because the screenshot proved fraud, because it established a pattern. Patterns mattered. Thursday evening, Grant finally called. He almost never contacted me directly. "Nora." His voice sounded unusually friendly. "You've got a minute?" "Sure. We've got a couple vendor contracts that still need signatures. I can stop by Friday." My grip tightened around the phone. "What kind of contracts?" "Nothing major. Mostly liability acknowledgments." Something felt off. "I'd rather read them first." A short silence. "They're standard forms." "I know. I'd still like to read them." His tone changed almost instantly. "Nora, you're making this harder than it needs to be." That sentence sounded familiar. Growing up, every boundary I ever tried to establish somehow became my fault. "I'll read them. Then I'll decide." He sighed heavily. "Fine. We'll have them ready." The conversation ended politely, but the warmth was gone. Friday afternoon, I arrived at the house. Mom greeted me with another performance-quality hug. "So glad you're here." Grant was already waiting in the dining room. 3 documents sat neatly arranged beside a pen. He pushed them toward me. "Nothing complicated." I picked up the first page. Volunteer liability waiver. Reasonable. The second. Equipment responsibility agreement. Also reasonable. The third document immediately caught my attention. Halfway down the page appeared a paragraph titled, Administrative Authorization. It granted the signer authority to communicate with vendors, approve operational expenses, and act on behalf of Homes of Grace during event preparation. I looked up. "This isn't a volunteer form." Grant barely smiled. "It's just administrative language. I wouldn't be comfortable signing this." Mom stepped into the room carrying coffee. "Nora." "It's only so vendors can call you if something comes up." I remembered the invoices, the fake approvals, the commercial loan. No, this wasn't routine. It was another opportunity. I quietly slid the papers back across the table. "I'm not signing." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Mom laughed. Not naturally, carefully. "Oh, sweetheart. Nobody's trying to trick you." I met her eyes. "I didn't say you were." That ended the conversation faster than any argument could have. Grant gathered the documents without another word. But something had changed. He looked disappointed, not angry, disappointed. Almost like a plan hadn't worked. As I stood to leave, Paige walked through the hallway carrying shopping bags. She glanced toward the table. "You still haven't signed?" "No." She rolled her eyes. "You always make everything complicated." Normally, I would have apologized. Instead, I smiled politely. "Maybe." Then I walked out. By Sunday evening, my phone began filling with messages from relatives. "Your mom says you're under a lot of stress." "Everything okay?" "Family comes first, Nora." I never answered emotionally. I simply saved every message, every screenshot, every timestamp, every assumption someone had repeated after hearing my mother's version. False narratives spread faster than facts, but they also left footprints. Monday morning, Thomas called. "How was the weekend?" "I think they wanted me to sign something." "What did you do?" "I read it." "And?" I walked away. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made me realize I had already changed. "Good. You stopped trying to keep the peace. You started protecting your position." When the call ended, I looked at the growing folder on my desk. 2 weeks earlier, it had contained one suspicious invoice. Now it contained emails, credit reports, screenshots, phone records, unsigned authorization forms, messages from relatives repeating the same carefully crafted story. Individually, none of them ended the case. Together, they were becoming something much more dangerous, not because they proved everything, because they showed the same people making the same choices over and over again. For the first time in my life, I understood something my grandmother had known all along. People rarely destroy themselves with one enormous lie. They do it with hundreds of small ones, confident no one will ever line them up in the right order. The strangest part about uncovering the truth wasn't finding documents. It was realizing other people had been holding pieces of the same puzzle all along. They simply didn't know where those pieces belonged. Monday morning started like every other one. Coffee, traffic, inventory reports, nothing unusual. Around 10:30, my phone vibrated. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar local number. Normally, I ignored unknown calls. For some reason, I answered. Hello? A woman hesitated before speaking. Is this Nora Whitaker? Yes. My name is Alice Monroe. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. I knew your grandmother. Everything inside me became still. Alice explained that she had volunteered with my grandmother for years through a local literacy program. They weren't best friends, but they'd spent nearly a decade organizing financial workshops for senior citizens. I wasn't sure whether I should call. I've thought about it for years. What changed? I asked. I saw your mother's charity advertisements. And then I remembered something Evelyn asked me to keep. I closed my office door. What did she ask you to keep? A sealed envelope. She told me never to give it to anyone unless you started asking questions about your family. I didn't speak. Neither did Alice. Finally, she asked quietly, Are you asking those questions now? Yes. I think I am. She suggested meeting the following evening at a small coffee shop downtown. Not her house, not mine. Neutral ground. It sounded exactly like something Grandma would have arranged. Tuesday evening, Alice arrived carrying an old canvas tote bag. She looked to be in her early 70s. Warm eyes, gray hair tied neatly behind her head. She smiled the moment she saw me. You really do look like Evelyn. I'd heard that twice in less than a week. For the first time, I took it as a compliment. After we ordered coffee, she reached into the tote and carefully removed a large manila envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in Grandma's handwriting, were 6 simple words. For Nora. Only if necessary. Alice slid it across the table. I never opened it. I promised her I wouldn't. My hands actually trembled as I lifted the flap. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a photocopy of a certified letter addressed to Vivian Whitaker. The date immediately caught my attention. 9 years earlier. Just 6 months before Grandma passed away. The letter had been written by an attorney. Its purpose was painfully clear. It formally demanded repayment of money withdrawn from an educational fund established for my benefit. I read the first paragraph twice, then a third time. Educational fund. Repayment. Withdrawn without authorization. My chest tightened. I looked at Alice. I never knew this existed. I don't think your grandmother wanted you to. The second document explained everything the first one didn't. It contained bank records showing transfers from an account titled Mercer Educational Fund. Amounts, dates, withdrawal confirmations. The total was almost identical to the amount I would have needed for college. For years, I believed there had never been money. The money had existed. It had simply disappeared. The final document was the certified mail receipt, signed, delivered, accepted. The signature belonged to Vivian. My mother hadn't misunderstood. She hadn't forgotten. She had received formal notice. She knew exactly what she had done. I leaned back slowly. Everything I had believed about leaving college shifted in a single moment. I hadn't lost my future because we were poor. I had lost it because someone else had decided my future was available to spend. Alice quietly stirred her tea. Evelyn cried after mailing that letter. I looked up. She did? Not because of the money. Because she realized she'd have to protect you from your own family. That sentence stayed with me. Protect me. Not convince me. Not rescue me. Protect me. Before leaving, Alice said one more thing. She never hated your mother. She was disappointed. Those are very different things. Driving home, I didn't feel rage. I expected to. Instead, I felt clarity. For years, I had blamed bad luck. Now I understood there had been choices, deliberate ones. The next morning, I scanned every page and emailed copies to Thomas. His reply arrived less than 15 minutes later. Excellent chain evidence. Preserve originals. Do not discuss these documents with anyone. Chain evidence. That phrase stood out. Every document wasn't simply proving one event, it was connecting another link. Later that afternoon, another unexpected call arrived. This time, it was Malcolm Price. I recognized his name immediately. He owned one of the largest building supply companies in western North Carolina. He had also donated to nearly every charity event my mother organized. I spoke with Thomas. He got straight to the point. I'd like to ask you something. Of course. Has anyone shown you the nonprofit registration for Homes of Grace? No. I've only seen promotional material. He sighed. I requested financial paperwork. They've delayed sending it twice. That bothered him. It bothered me too. Business owners don't postpone transparency unless transparency creates risk. Malcolm continued. I trusted Evelyn. If she believed something was wrong, I think it's time I started asking questions too. When the call ended, I realized something important. The investigation was no longer happening in isolation. People outside my family were beginning to notice inconsistencies on their own. Not because I had accused anyone, because the paperwork wasn't matching the public story. That evening, I updated my timeline again. Invoices, electronic signatures, commercial loan, educational fund, certified letter, witness statement, concerned donor. Each piece came from a different source, different years, different people. None of them depended on my memory. None of them relied on emotion. Grandma had once told me that the strongest truth is the one that doesn't need you standing beside it. I finally understood what she meant. The evidence had started learning how to speak for itself. And for the first time since this journey began, I wasn't the only one listening. For nearly 2 weeks, I had lived inside spreadsheets. Not because I enjoyed numbers, because numbers couldn't perform. People lied. Documents could be forged. Memories faded. But money always left footprints. Thomas called me early Wednesday morning. I'd like you to meet someone. Who? A forensic accountant. I think we've reached that stage. I drove to his office after work. This time, there was another woman waiting in the conference room. She stood when I walked in. Nora? I'm Julia Rains. Her handshake was firm. She looked to be in her 40s, dressed simply in a charcoal blazer with no jewelry except a wedding band. Thomas introduced us. Julia specializes in forensic accounting and nonprofit compliance. I've worked with her before. Julia smiled politely. I don't investigate people. I investigate transactions. That sounded exactly like something my grandmother would have appreciated. Thomas spread several documents across the conference table. Vendor invoices, my commercial loan paperwork, the educational fund records, copies of promotional material for Homes of Grace. Julia didn't begin with questions. She began with dates. When did the fundraising campaign officially begin? March, I answered. She nodded. The same month your identity first appeared. She circled the date with a blue pen. I don't believe in coincidences. Neither did I anymore. For the next hour, Julia reconstructed the timeline from scratch. She ignored assumptions. She ignored motives. She only followed money. The fake vendor approvals begin. Then the commercial loan. Then promotional spending increases. Then public fundraising begins. She tapped her pen against the table. Everything accelerates together. Thomas leaned back. What does that suggest? Julia answered without hesitation. Cash flow pressure. She explained it patiently. Companies rarely commit financial fraud because they're profitable. They do it when legitimate cash begins disappearing. Someone starts moving money around. Small adjustments become larger ones. Eventually, they begin borrowing against future income. Or someone else's identity. The room fell silent. She wasn't describing a theory anymore. She was describing a pattern. Julia requested every financial document I legally possessed. I handed over my folder. She organized everything into neat stacks. Then she stopped at one document. The vendor invoice from the print company. What account paid this? I don't know. We're going to find out. The following afternoon, she called. I found something interesting. That was an understatement. The payment for the printing invoice hadn't come from a registered nonprofit account. It had come from Whitaker Renovations. I frowned. But the event is supposed to be a charity. Exactly. She emailed me a highlighted copy of the payment confirmation. Business checking account. Whitaker Renovations. Not Homes of Grace. Not a charitable organization. Not a foundation. Grants Construction Company. At first, I didn't understand why that mattered. Julia explained. If a charity is collecting donations, its financial structure has to be transparent. If operational expenses are being paid through a private business, someone needs to explain why. That explanation didn't exist. Not yet. The next discovery came almost by accident. Julia reviewed promotional material from the gala website. One page listed donation options: Gold sponsor, Silver sponsor, Community partner. Each button directed donors to an online payment portal. She clicked one. The payment page opened. Business name, routing number, merchant account. Julia became unusually quiet. What? She turned her laptop toward me. Read the merchant name. It wasn't Homes of Grace. It wasn't a nonprofit. It was Whitaker Renovations, LLC. I stared at the screen. People thought they were donating to a housing charity. Their money was being processed through Grant's company. Thomas folded his arms. Can that be legal? It depends, Julia answered carefully. If everything is disclosed properly. She paused. I don't think it was. She immediately began downloading public registration records, state nonprofit filings, business licenses, IRS database entries. The results came back quickly. There was no registered nonprofit organization named Homes of Grace Winter Benefit, no charitable corporation, no tax-exempt registration, no fiscal sponsor, nothing. The charity existed online. It existed on banners. It existed in speeches. Legally, it barely existed at all. I felt sick. Not because of the money, because people trusted my mother. Church members, retirees, small business owners, families who probably believed every dollar was helping someone. Thomas looked at me. This is becoming much larger than identity theft. I nodded slowly. I know. Julia wasn't finished. She requested archived versions of the event website. The earliest copy showed something different. Originally, the donation page linked to a temporary fundraising platform. 3 weeks later, it had quietly been replaced by the Whitaker Renovations payment processor. No announcement, no explanation, just a silent change. Someone updated this intentionally. Julia said it almost to herself. Most donors would never notice. She printed every archived page. Each one received a date, a source, a reference number. The evidence chain was becoming stronger. Every document connected to another one. Every answer created a new question. Before leaving, Julia handed me a thin folder. Take this home. Inside were comparison charts, flow diagrams, timelines showing how vendor payments, fundraising activity, and my identity theft all overlapped. I looked at the first page. For the first time, I could actually see the pattern. Not emotionally, visually. Nothing stood alone anymore. The forged signatures, the commercial loan, the vendor approvals, the business account, the fake charity structure. Each decision depended on the previous one. Thomas quietly smiled. This is why we never rushed. He was right. If I'd confronted my family after finding the first forged signature, I would have walked into an argument. Now, we were walking toward documented financial misconduct. As I drove home that evening, I realized my grandmother had been right about something else. Truth rarely arrives as one dramatic revelation. It arrives one verified fact at a time. And eventually, the facts become impossible to separate from each other. I used to think guilty people panicked. Television taught me that. Someone gets caught, they confess, they run, or they disappear. Real life wasn't like that. People who have spent years believing they'll never be questioned don't panic. They double down. They convince themselves they can still control the story. Thomas warned me that if Grant realized someone was following the money, he'd probably stop worrying about appearances and start worrying about paperwork. He was right. Friday afternoon, Julia called while I was leaving work. I think they've started cleaning house. I stopped beside my car. What happened? One of the vendor records disappeared from the online portal. Deleted? Not exactly. It was replaced. She explained that the original invoice number still existed, but the document attached to it had changed. The new version carried a different description, different purchase category, different approval language. The total amount was identical. Only the explanation had changed. They're rewriting history, I said. Julia answered immediately. They're trying. But digital systems remember revisions. Grandma would have smiled at that. Paper remembered. Apparently, servers did too. Thomas immediately instructed Julia to preserve every archived version she had already downloaded. He also drafted a formal preservation notice directed to Whitaker Renovations and every major vendor connected to the gala. I asked him what that actually meant. It means they've officially been warned. If records disappear after this, it becomes a much bigger legal problem. Not because documents vanished, because someone made them vanish after being told not to. Monday morning, another strange thing happened. Grant called me. He almost sounded cheerful. Nora, thought maybe we could have lunch. That had never happened before, not once. I've got work. It won't take long. I appreciate it. But no. A long pause followed. Finally, he laughed. You've changed. Maybe I had. Or maybe I had simply stopped confusing obedience with kindness. That evening, Paige uploaded another behind-the-scenes video preparing for the gala. Most viewers probably saw decorations, flowers, lighting, gift baskets. I noticed something else. Behind her, for less than 2 seconds, a whiteboard listed volunteer assignments. One name had been crossed out, another written over it. The handwriting matched Grant's. The replacement assignment moved financial check-in responsibilities away from one volunteer and towards someone named Denise Halpern. I paused the frame. Denise. I'd seen that name before. She appeared on several accounting emails attached to vendor confirmations. I sent the screenshot to Julia. Her reply came less than 5 minutes later. That's the company bookkeeper. The next afternoon, Thomas called. Denise contacted us. I nearly dropped my coffee. She did? She won't meet yet. But she has questions. What kind of questions? The kind people ask when they realize they're being blamed for decisions they didn't make. Apparently, Denise had received the document preservation notice. She wasn't worried about old invoices. She was worried because Grant had recently instructed her to clean up internal accounting descriptions before year-end. At first, she thought it was normal bookkeeping. Then the preservation notice arrived. Now she wasn't so sure. Thomas didn't pressure her. He simply told her one thing. If records are accurate, you have nothing to fear. If they're not, protect yourself. 2 days later, Denise called again. This time she agreed to meet. Not at the office. Not at her workplace. A public park. She arrived carrying nothing except a reusable grocery bag. She looked exhausted. She never sat down. "I can't stay long." Thomas nodded. "We understand." She looked directly at me. "I didn't know they were using your name." I believed her immediately. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it. There was no performance, only relief. She explained that Grant handled outside financing himself. Vivian handled donor communication. Paige promoted the events online. Denise entered transactions after receiving approvals. "Recently," she said quietly, "Grant started asking me to change descriptions after invoices had already been paid." "What kind of changes?" She took a folded piece of paper from her bag. I wrote them down. Not copied, not photographed. Written from memory after she became uncomfortable. One instruction changed marketing expenses into community outreach. Another relabeled equipment purchases as housing assistance materials. A third removed references to Whitaker renovations entirely. I looked at Thomas. He understood immediately. They weren't correcting bookkeeping. They were changing the narrative. Denise nodded. "Last week he asked if old emails could be deleted." That sentence hung in the air. "Did you?" She shook her head. "No. I told him the server automatically keeps backups." Grant apparently believed deleting inbox messages would erase the past. He had no idea most business systems preserved far more than users realized. Before leaving, Denise handed Thomas a small flash drive. I copied policy manuals. Nothing confidential, just procedures. If someone claims I ignored company rules, those manuals prove what the rules actually were. It wasn't explosive evidence. It was something better. Context. Proof that established procedures existed before Grant began changing records. As Denise walked away, Thomas slipped the flash drive into an evidence envelope. He smiled slightly. "People usually think cases are won by dramatic discoveries. They're usually won by ordinary employees who decide they've had enough." Driving home, I realized the investigation had quietly crossed another line. At first I had documents, then I had financial records, then I had independent witnesses. Now, I had someone from inside Grant's own company confirming that records were being altered after questions began. No courtroom had heard our case. No public accusation had been made. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Grant still believed he was solving a paperwork problem. He didn't realize every correction, every deleted description, every rewritten expense created another timestamp, another revision history, another witness, another piece of evidence. Grandma used to tell me that truth has a strange habit. The harder someone tries to bury it, the more dirt they leave on the shovel. For the first time since this all began, I understood exactly what she meant. Grant wasn't destroying evidence, he was documenting intent. And he didn't even know he was doing it. 3 weeks before the gala, everything suddenly became louder. Mom's social media exploded with countdown posts. Paige uploaded behind-the-scenes videos almost every day. Grant appeared in local business interviews, talking about giving back to the community. To everyone else, it looked like success. To me, it looked like pressure. Pressure made people careless. Thomas had warned me that once people became committed to a public story, they would sacrifice almost anything to keep it alive. I was watching it happen in real time. Every morning, another promotional email landed in my inbox. Every afternoon, another sponsored post appeared online. Every evening, another local business announced a donation. The gala wasn't simply becoming an event. It was becoming their entire reputation. That mattered, because the bigger the stage, the harder it would be to escape once the truth arrived. One Tuesday afternoon, Julia called while I was driving home. "I think I found something." That sentence had become surprisingly familiar. "What is it?" I compared every version of the gala website. And? They changed more than payment information. She emailed me a series of screenshots. Each version had been archived weeks apart. Most visitors would never notice the differences. Julia did. Originally, the website described Homes of Grace as a community fundraising initiative. 2 weeks later, the wording quietly changed. Now it called itself a registered charitable housing program. No registration number appeared anywhere. No nonprofit identification. Just different language. Someone hadn't corrected the website. They had upgraded the illusion. Julia highlighted every revision. Each one carried a timestamp. Each one was archived. Every edit had become another document, another piece of the chain. That evening, Thomas invited me back to his office. When I arrived, 3 folders already sat on the conference table. Mine, Julia's, and one labeled simply, Witnesses. I looked at him. "We have more?" He nodded. "More than I expected." Inside the folder sat written summaries. Alice, Denise, Malcolm Price. Each had agreed to provide formal statements if necessary. Not because Thomas pressured them, because each of them had independently reached the same conclusion. Something wasn't right. None of them knew the entire story. Together, they almost did. Thomas drew a rectangle on his legal pad. "This is the ballroom." He marked circles around it. "Here's where the donors sit, the board members, the city representatives, the sponsors." He looked at me. "Your mother chose this stage. We're simply allowing it to remain available." I finally understood. We weren't creating a public confrontation. We were refusing to prevent one. Wednesday morning, another email arrived from the gala organizers. Subject: Final Operations Schedule. I almost deleted it. Instead, I opened the attachment. The document listed every volunteer assignment, every vendor arrival, every presentation, every award. Near the bottom, my name appeared again. Nora Whitaker, Director of Event Operations. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably reckless. I had never accepted the role, never signed anything, never attended planning meetings after refusing the authorization forms. Yet there I was, officially responsible for operations. I forwarded the schedule directly to Thomas. His reply came within minutes. "Excellent. Preserve the metadata." That was all. No excitement, no celebration. Evidence had become routine. Later that afternoon, Malcolm called. "I finally asked to see the financial packet." "What happened?" "They delayed again." "What reason?" "Still being finalized." His voice carried years of business experience. "Nora, legitimate organizations don't hide financial summaries from major donors. They hand them out." Another independent observation. Another witness. Another piece of context. By Friday afternoon, something else changed. Grant stopped calling. So did Mom. Instead, Paige suddenly became unusually friendly. She texted me, "Mom really misses you." 10 minutes later, "We'd love for you to stand with the family during opening remarks." An hour later, "People have been asking whether you're coming." I showed every message to Thomas. He smiled. "They need you there." "Why?" "Because you're becoming part of their credibility." That sentence stayed with me all weekend. Not their daughter, not their family, their credibility. Without realizing it, they had spent months placing my name on contracts, schedules, vendor approvals, promotional material, and operational documents. Now they wanted my face beside theirs. The paperwork wasn't enough anymore. They needed the image. Monday morning, Julia called again. I checked the QR code on the latest invitations. "What about it?" "It redirects somewhere different." I opened my laptop immediately. She was right. The old donation page had disappeared. Now the QR code pointed directly to a payment processor registered under Whitaker Renovations. No explanation, no disclaimer, just another quiet change. Julia saved the transaction path before anyone could modify it again. Another timestamp, another archived version, another step in the evidence chain. By now I had stopped feeling overwhelmed by documents. Instead, I noticed patterns. Every decision my family made solved one immediate problem and quietly created another future one. Thomas once told me that desperate people don't usually make smarter decisions. They simply make faster ones. Tuesday evening, we held what Thomas called a preparation meeting. Not a strategy session. Not a rehearsal. Preparation. Julia reviewed financial exhibits. Alice confirmed she still had the original envelope. Denise agreed to preserve additional accounting records. Malcolm promised he would request financial disclosures publicly if the opportunity arose. Nobody talked about embarrassing my family. Nobody discussed revenge. Every conversation centered around one question. If someone asks, "Can we prove it?" That difference mattered. Facts first, emotion second. As I drove home that night, Christmas lights covered nearly every neighborhood in Asheville. Families were decorating trees, children were building snowmen in front yards. The whole town seemed excited about the holiday season. Somewhere across town, my mother was probably finalizing seating charts. Grant was likely rehearsing his speech. Paige was almost certainly planning the perfect live stream. They believed they were preparing for the biggest night of their year. In a way, they were right. The difference was that they thought they were preparing to celebrate. I knew they were preparing to be questioned. Not by me, by their own paperwork. And paperwork, unlike people, never forgets what it has already said. The ballroom looked exactly the way my mother wanted it to. Elegant, warm, perfectly staged. White tablecloths covered every table. Thousands of tiny lights hung from the ceiling like stars. Fresh evergreen wreaths framed the entrance. At the center of the room stood a massive stage with 2 projection screens displaying the same message. Homes of Grace Winter Benefit Building, hope together. Guests arrived wearing tuxedos and evening gowns. Business owners shook hands. Church leaders greeted volunteers. Local reporters moved quietly through the room, collecting interviews before the program began. Anyone walking into that ballroom would have believed they were attending one of the most respected charity events in Western North Carolina. That illusion had taken months to build. It would take less than an hour to begin falling apart. I arrived 15 minutes before the program started. Not early, not late. Exactly when Thomas had suggested. I wasn't carrying a stack of documents. I wasn't trying to make a scene. The only folder in my hand contained copies of records that had already been preserved somewhere else. I wasn't there to surprise anyone. I was there because I refused to let my name continue being used without my consent. Mom spotted me almost immediately. Her face brightened with the same practiced smile I'd seen my entire life. "There you are." She hugged me before I could respond. "I knew you'd come. I said I would." She stepped back and looked me over. "I'm so happy we're doing this together." Those words sounded harmless, but they weren't. She wanted people nearby to hear them. Grant walked over carrying note cards. "I've got reserved seats for the family." "I'm fine sitting wherever." He laughed. "Tonight we all sit together." Again. Not a request, a performance. Paige was already live streaming behind the stage. She waved when she saw me. "I knew you'd change your mind." "I never changed it." She frowned slightly. "What?" "I never agreed with the version you imagined." Before she could answer, someone called her name for another interview. She hurried away without another word. Thomas arrived a few minutes later with Julia. Neither of them approached me immediately. That was intentional. From across the room, he simply nodded once. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The opening program began at 7. A string quartet played softly while guests finished dinner. Then Mom walked onto the stage to applause. She looked completely confident. For years, she had controlled every room she entered. This one seemed no different. "Good evening, everyone." "Thank you for believing in our mission." She spoke beautifully, about compassion, about housing insecurity, about community partnerships, about family, especially family. Halfway through her speech, she smiled toward my table. "I've always believed the strongest families serve together." She extended her hand toward me. "Nora, would you come join us?" Hundreds of heads turned, exactly as she intended. If I refused, I would look bitter. If I accepted quietly, I would silently approve everything surrounding this event. I stood. walked calmly toward the stage, accepted the microphone she offered. She expected gratitude. Instead, I spoke slowly. My name is Nora Whitaker. I'd like to clarify something before tonight continues. The ballroom became perfectly still. I am not the director of event operations. I've never accepted that position. I've never signed authorization to represent Homes of Grace. The smile disappeared from Mom's face, only slightly. Grant stepped toward me. Nora, we can discuss this later. I looked at him. I've tried. Silence settled across the room. Not angry silence, confused silence. Grant reached for the microphone. I stepped back. I only want one thing. The truth. At one of the front tables, Malcolm Price slowly stood. His voice carried naturally across the ballroom. As one of tonight's sponsors, I have a question. He looked directly at Vivian. Could we see the charity's financial registration before additional donations are collected? Mom blinked once. We'll gladly provide that after the event. Malcolm didn't sit down. I'm asking now. Several other sponsors exchanged glances. Someone near the back quietly lowered a wine glass onto the table. Thomas stood, not dramatically, simply as an attorney addressing a public matter. My client has documentation indicating there may be confusion regarding organizational authority. Grant immediately interrupted. This is inappropriate. Thomas nodded politely, which is precisely why clarity benefits everyone. Julia handed Thomas a thin folder, not a stack, just enough. He placed one document on the podium. The payment processor connected to tonight's QR code. Another. The registered owner of that merchant account. Another. Corporate ownership records. No speeches, only documents. People leaned forward. Mom tried to laugh. There must be some misunderstanding. Before Thomas could answer, Malcolm spoke again. Is the donation account registered to Whitaker Renovations? Grant's face changed, only for a second. But I saw it. He hadn't expected Malcolm to know the company name. Thomas answered quietly. Yes. The current payment processor routes donations through Whitaker Renovations, LLC. Murmurs spread through the ballroom. Not outrage. Questions. Exactly the response Thomas wanted. Questions created accountability. Arguments created sympathy. Mom stepped back to the microphone. Grant's company simply provides administrative support. Julia calmly handed another document to one of the event coordinators operating the projection system. A few moments later, the ballroom screens changed. Instead of promotional slides, a comparison appeared. Archived versions of the gala website, different dates, different wording, different payment destinations, every revision time-stamped, every version independently preserved, no opinions, only history. The room became completely silent again. Then another voice spoke. Denise. She had quietly entered through the side doors almost 20 minutes earlier. Most people hadn't noticed. She stood beside one of the sponsor tables. I maintain accounting records for Whitaker Renovations. Every head turned toward her. I was instructed to relabel expenses after payments had already been made. Grant stared at her. He didn't say a word. His silence said enough. Alice stood next. She held the sealed manila envelope. I kept this for Evelyn Mercer. She removed copies of the certified letter regarding the Mercer Educational Fund. I believe people deserve to know this history before deciding who they're listening to. Nobody applauded. Nobody shouted. The room didn't explode into chaos. It became something much worse for my family. It became skeptical. The carefully polished story they'd spent years repeating no longer stood alone. For every statement, there was now a document. For every explanation, a witness. For every denial, a timeline. My mother looked around the ballroom as if searching for someone to rescue the evening. No one moved, because for the first time, the microphone no longer belonged to the loudest person in the room. It belonged to the evidence. And evidence didn't need to raise its voice. Nobody spoke to me as I walked out of the ballroom. Not because they were avoiding me, because they were trying to understand what they had just witnessed. People who had arrived expecting an evening of celebration were now leaving with dozens of unanswered questions. That was exactly what Thomas wanted. He didn't want public outrage. He wanted official scrutiny. There was a difference. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the first phone call arrived. It wasn't from my mother. It wasn't from Grant. It came from Malcolm Price. I've suspended my company's sponsorship. His voice was calm. I've also informed the other corporate donors that no additional funds should be transferred until everything is verified. I thanked him. He stopped me before I hung up. Nora, I believed your grandmother for 30 years. I'm sorry I didn't ask questions sooner. That apology meant more than he probably realized. Not because he had owed me one, because someone had finally admitted that believing appearances has consequences. The calls continued throughout the week. A regional bank contacted Whitaker Renovations requesting clarification regarding the merchant account used during the gala. 2 suppliers placed future deliveries on hold until outstanding invoices could be reviewed. The city's Community Development Office suspended discussions about a small housing grant Grant had been pursuing. No accusations, no dramatic announcements, just pauses. Business pauses, financial pauses, institutional pauses. Thomas called Thursday afternoon. They're starting to feel pressure. How do you know? They've hired litigation counsel. That didn't surprise him. It surprised me. I thought they'd try to explain everything. They still think this is a public relations problem. He paused. It isn't. It's a documentation problem. The following Monday, Whitaker Renovations received formal requests to preserve financial records, electronic communications, vendor contracts, accounting logs, and server backups. Every notice carried the same message: do not alter, do not delete, do not destroy. By then, Denise had officially retained independent legal counsel. She informed investigators that she intended to cooperate fully. Not because anyone forced her, because she refused to become the person left holding responsibility for decisions she never made. A week later, she signed an affidavit. She described in careful detail how Grant instructed her to revise transaction descriptions after payments had already cleared. She attached internal accounting procedures, proving those revisions violated normal company practices. She included dates, meeting notes, software audit references. Everything she submitted could be independently verified. That mattered. Thomas explained why. Witnesses tell stories. Documents support stories. When both agree, courts pay attention. Meanwhile, Julia continued following the money. Every few days she uncovered another transfer, another reimbursement, another expense categorized one way internally and another way publicly. Most weren't enormous. A few $1,000s here, several hundred there. One payment for promotional photography, another for custom packaging connected to Paige's upcoming product launch. Individually, they looked ordinary. Together, they revealed a pattern. Charitable fundraising had quietly supported private business expenses. The investigation wasn't growing because someone discovered one shocking transaction. It was growing because ordinary transactions refused to make sense. Then came discovery. Grant's attorneys requested copies of every document supporting my claims. Thomas smiled when he received the request. They're finally asking the right questions. For almost 2 weeks, our office organized evidence, not dramatically, methodically. Every document received an exhibit number. Every email received a timeline reference. Every screenshot included metadata verification. Grandma had once spent an afternoon teaching me how to organize old utility bills by date. At the time, I thought she was simply particular. Now I realized she had been teaching litigation before I even knew what litigation meant. During discovery, another important fact surfaced. The electronic signature company produced access logs under subpoena. Every document signed using my name originated from the same internet connection. The IP address traced back to Whitaker Renovations' administrative office. Not my apartment, not my workplace, Grant's office. The company also provided device identification records. Every signature came from the same desktop computer. One machine, one office, months of activity. That single production quietly eliminated every alternative explanation. No hacker, no random identity theft, no misunderstanding, just consistency. When Thomas showed me the report, he didn't celebrate. He simply added another tab to the growing binder. Evidence doesn't become stronger because we get excited. It becomes stronger because it keeps agreeing with itself. A month after the gala, Paige released a short video titled "Setting the Record Straight." I watched it once. She never addressed the financial records, never mentioned the forged signatures, never explained the merchant account. Instead, she talked about family misunderstandings. Comments underneath the video quickly filled with questions she couldn't answer. Why was your sister listed on contracts she says she never signed? Where did the donations actually go? Is Homes of Grace a registered nonprofit? The video disappeared less than 24 hours later, not because anyone forced her, because the old strategy no longer worked. Narrative had finally collided with documentation. Mom reached out several times. Voicemails, text messages, emails. She never apologized. Instead, she asked to talk privately. Thomas advised against responding. If someone has something important to say, they can say it through counsel. For years, I would have felt guilty. Now I understood that private conversations often create private denials. Documents create accountability. 3 months after the gala, mediation finally took place. No raised voices, no dramatic speeches, just conference rooms, attorneys, binders, financial summaries, independent reports. By the end of the second day, Whitaker Renovations agreed to a confidential financial settlement regarding the misuse of my identity and the resulting damage to my credit. Additional corporate governance changes followed. Grant resigned from direct financial oversight while outside accountants completed a full review. The trust's ownership interest became impossible to ignore. For the first time in his life, he had to answer to someone other than himself. As we walked out of the mediation building, Thomas handed me one thin folder. Inside was the signed settlement agreement. Nothing about it looked emotional. No triumphant language, no dramatic declarations, just signatures, dates, terms, obligations. I smiled. Not because I had won, because after years of hearing stories about who I supposedly was, the last word belonged to paper, just like Grandma always said it would. 3 months after the mediation ended, Thomas called and asked if I had any plans that Saturday. "I have one last thing that belongs to you," he said. His voice carried the same calm certainty it always had. No drama, no mystery, just one final step. We met outside a small bank in downtown Asheville. It wasn't the same office where we'd first discussed the trust. This building was older, built from red brick with brass doors that had clearly been polished for decades. Thomas held the brass key I'd carried for weeks. "You've waited 9 years," he said. "I think you've earned the rest." He unlocked a safe deposit box numbered 218. The number matched the tag that had hung from the key inside Grandma's Navy box. He stepped back. "I'll give you some privacy." Inside the box wasn't cash. There were no diamonds. No secret fortune waiting to change my life overnight. There was a single cedar envelope, a folded property survey, and another leather notebook. The envelope had my name written across the front, not in legal handwriting, in Grandma's. I opened it carefully. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. The first line made me smile before I reached the second. "If you're reading this, you've finally stopped believing everyone else's version of you." I had to pause. For years, I had measured myself through my family's opinions. Successful enough, helpful enough, patient enough, grateful enough. Every standard belonged to someone else. Grandma continued, "I never wanted to leave you money before I knew you could protect yourself." Money without confidence becomes someone else's opportunity. Truth without patience becomes another argument. I prayed you would discover both before you discovered this letter. I folded the page into my lap and looked out the small office window. She had known, years before any of this happened. She had known exactly what kind of person she wanted me to become, not someone who inherited assets, someone capable of protecting them. The second notebook was thinner than the first. Most pages were blank. Only the opening section contained writing. It wasn't bookkeeping. It wasn't legal advice. It was more personal than anything Grandma had ever said while she was alive. She wrote about my first day of kindergarten. The afternoon I learned to ride a bicycle. The day I cried because another student said I wasn't smart enough for advanced math. She remembered everything, even moments I had forgotten. One paragraph stood out more than any other. You apologize too quickly. Kind people often mistake guilt for responsibility. They are not the same thing. Reading those words felt strangely uncomfortable. Because they described my entire adult life. I apologized for needing help, for asking questions, for setting boundaries. Sometimes I apologized simply because other people looked disappointed. No more. At the bottom of the final written page, beneath every journal entry, every memory, and every lesson, Grandma had written only one sentence. The last line is yours. Nothing else. No instructions, no hidden clues, no final puzzle. Just space. Blank paper. Waiting. Thomas knocked softly before opening the door. You all right? I smiled. I think so. He noticed the notebook. She always intended that to stay unfinished. We left the bank and drove separately to Lake Lure. I had seen photographs of the cabin before. None of them prepared me for the real thing. It sat quietly among tall pines overlooking the water. Not large, not luxurious, just peaceful. The porch wrapped around the front of the house exactly the way it had in the old picture. For the first time in months. There were no court filings waiting for signatures, no spreadsheets, no witness statements, no evidence folders, only silence. I unlocked the front door using the same brass key that had waited 9 years inside the Navy box. The lock turned smoothly, almost as if the house had been expecting me. Inside, everything smelled like cedar and old books. Sunlight reached through the living room windows and settled across hardwood floors that Grandma had probably walked on hundreds of times. There was a stone fireplace, a small writing desk, shelves lined with novels and accounting books standing side by side. I laughed quietly. That combination somehow felt exactly like her. Over the next several weeks, I moved in slowly. Not because I owned very much, because I wanted to appreciate every step. I painted nothing, changed almost nothing. The cabin didn't need to become someone else's idea of home. It already was one. My consulting work grew steadily. Without the damage to my credit hanging over me, opportunities became easier to accept. Clients recommended me to other clients. I wasn't becoming wealthy. I was becoming stable. For the first time in my adult life, stability felt extraordinary. Thomas eventually informed me that the trust administration was complete. Grant had fulfilled the settlement terms. The ownership restructuring of Whitaker Renovations had been finalized. The investigation into the fundraising structure had closed with financial penalties and compliance requirements. Everything that needed to be decided had been decided. Oddly enough, that wasn't what gave me peace. Peace arrived on a quiet Sunday morning. Coffee in one hand, Grandma's notebook in the other. I sat on the porch overlooking the lake. The final page remained blank except for her last sentence. The last line is yours. I picked up a fountain pen she had kept inside the desk drawer. For several minutes I couldn't think of anything worthy enough to write. Then I realized she had never asked for perfect words, only honest ones. So I wrote a single sentence beneath hers. Paper remembers, and now, so do I. I closed the notebook, not because the story was ending, because it no longer needed proving. For years, my family had convinced me that I was difficult, ungrateful, a burden. Those words had shaped the way I saw myself long before they shaped the way others saw me. The legal documents corrected the public record. But Grandma's lessons corrected something much deeper. They gave me permission to trust my own memory, to believe evidence over manipulation, to choose boundaries without guilt. People sometimes ask whether I ever reconciled with my mother. The answer surprises them. I stopped asking that question. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. I genuinely hope she finds peace someday. I simply learned that her healing is not my responsibility. The same is true for Grant, for Paige, for every person who built a comfortable life on the assumption that I would always remain silent. I don't carry anger anymore. Anger requires constant attention. Freedom doesn't. When the sun began setting behind the mountains, I looked across the lake and thought about the little navy box that had traveled with me for nearly a decade. For years, I believed it contained my inheritance. I was wrong. The inheritance had never been the trust, or the cabin, or the investment account. My real inheritance was a way of seeing the truth without needing permission from anyone else. And that turned out to be worth far more than anything money could have purchased.